need to do this. Okay. Well, that Julia was very kind. She also, every once in a while, comes into my classes and gives them a little bit of reality about, well, we'll just leave it at that. Um, you'll excuse me. I need cheat sheets. I'm an old broad. Okay. Uh, Much of what I'm going to talk about, you've already heard from both Justin and the film, which was a great film, by the way. But bear with me. Okay. Indiana had the lowest turnout rate in the country in the last midterm elections. And there are a number of reasons for that depressing statistic. First of all, although Hoosiers are rarely in the vanguard of anything, as we know, we do remain on the cutting edge when it comes to voter suppression tactics. To begin with, we were among the very first states to pass the so-called voter ID laws, and ours remains one of the nation's strictest of those laws. I did not know until I served on a panel recently, and Beth White was a co-panelist, that in Indiana, it is not enough that you take to the polls a government-issued ID with your picture on it. That ID also has to have an expiration date on it. So, all the student IDs that we do at IUPUI doesn't work because they don't have an expiration date. I would think that it would take quite a long time to age out of the picture, but there you go. The legal challenge to that law, as Bill, who's sitting here and was part of that challenge, can attest, was unsuccessful, largely because its actual operation was pretty speculative at the point we brought the lawsuit. Since the Seventh Circuit had rejected the challenge to Indiana's act, it's become clear even to Judge Posner, who voted to uphold the law on that panel, that its sole purpose was to discourage voting by poor and minority voters who might be expected to vote Democrat. Voter ID laws were a remedy for a non-existent problem, in-person voting fraud. But the lawmakers in what Harrison Ullman, some of you remember Harrison, used to call the world's worst legislature, have not rested on their laurels. This last session, lawmakers voted down an effort to keep the polls open until 8 o'clock. Indiana's polls close at 6, which is much earlier than in most states. That makes it much more difficult for non-professional working people to vote. Lawmakers have also left in place the ability of a single member of a county election board to prevent the establishment of a voting center. Here in Marion County, as you'll all recall, one member of the election board has routinely blocked efforts to do that because we wouldn't want to make voting convenient. Laws making voting more onerous are only one reason among many for low voter turnout and for disappointing citizen engagement across the board. I'm going to suggest 3 others that combine to depress interest in government and the electoral process: gerrymandering, widespread distrust of government, and low levels of civic literacy. Today, of course, our focus is on gerrymandering. Every 10 years, as you've heard, the Indiana General Assembly engages in what individual legislators will call redistricting and what we will call gerrymandering after former Vice President Elbridge Gerry. It will be an intensely partisan endeavor, and that's true no matter which party is in charge. And it will be viewed by most Hoosiers as highly technical and profoundly boring. That redistricting, however, will have a much greater effect on how Indiana is governed for the ensuing decade than most, if not all, of the votes that are cast in the elections to follow. Those of you in this room know the drill. Whichever party wins a majority in the November elections preceding redistricting wins the privilege of drawing the maps, and those maps will have, as you have seen today an outsized influence over the political agenda for the state. The goal, of course, is to provide as many safe seats as possible. More for the party in charge, obviously, but also, as we've seen, for the minority party, because in order to retain control, the winners need to cram as many of the losers into as few districts as possible, which makes those districts safe as well. While we've engaged in this effort since Vice President Gary's time, and he signed the Declaration of Independence, the advent of computers has made the process far, far more efficient and arguably far more damaging. I was surprised to note the message about the ability now to include Google Maps. I mean, we can go down that marital bed in a heartbeat. Okay. Neighborhoods, cities, towns, townships, even precincts are evaluated solely on the basis of their voting history and then broken up to meet the political needs of the map makers. Numbers are what drive the results, not compactness of districts, not communities of interest, and certainly not democratic competitiveness. So let's tick off some of the more obvious results of this process. As we've said, the interests of cities, neighborhoods, and so forth are less likely to be represented. Safe districts enable sloppy legislation and dubious ethics. If you're guaranteed victory at every election, it's hard to be motivated and interested, and very easy to become lazy and arrogant and unethical. I mean, Eric Turner was a recent example here in Indiana, but there are many others. He, for those of you who don't remember, was reelected after he resigned for his ethical problem. Anyway, that's what you call a safe district.
The complaint had nothing to do with it. He was called to the ministry.
Just shoot me now. Okay. Okay. Party preoccupation with gerrymandering consumes an enormous amount of money and energy that could arguably be better directed. Safe seats allow politicians to scuttle popular measures without fear of retribution. And at the federal level, of course, campaign finance reform is a great example of that. Lack of competitiveness also makes it impossible to trace campaign donations, since unopposed candidates will send their unneeded money to those running in more competitive districts. So when the folks with family-friendly libraries send a check to Representative Sensor, who is unopposed, he then sends it to Senator Me Too, who is in a hot race, and Senator Me Too's campaign report shows only a contribution from Representative Sensor. Those are just a few of the more obvious effects of gerrymandering. There are plenty of others, and most of them will probably be discussed or have been discussed today. But there are two other consequences that may be less obvious and that I think deserve some special attention and concern. First of all, the lack of competitiveness breeds voter apathy and reduced political participation. Why get involved if the result is foreordained? Why donate money to a sure loser? For that matter, unless you're trying to buy some political influence, why donate to a sure winner? Why volunteer or vote when those efforts are pointless? I had a student, periodically, I know this will come as a shock to Julia and others, but I periodically launch into these little sermons in my class, and one of them precedes each election. And right before this last primary in my graduate class, I went through my, how many of you are registered to vote, and that bit. And a young man, very good student, raised his hand and said, I always vote, but I live in Noblesville. And before I went to vote this time, I checked online to make sure that the lines had not been redrawn and that my voting place was still at the same location. And then I thought, well, I'm online, I'll take a look at the ballot. And there were no contests. Why should I go vote if there's no one to vote for? It's a question that I can't answer. And at any rate, not only do voters lack incentives for participation, it becomes increasingly difficult to recruit credible candidates to run on the ticket of the sure loser party. The result is that in many of these races, voters are left with a choice between the anointed and the annoying. Marginal candidates who offer no new ideas, no energy, and no genuine challenge of any sort. Those kinds of contests simply exacerbate voter apathy. Now, you may think I'm exaggerating, although those of you in this room probably know that I'm not. How many safe districts could there be? Well, we heard about the state representative districts. Let me tell you, our legislators may not be the swiftest when it comes to a lot of issues, but they have self-perpetuation down to a science. In 2014, there were 25 state Senate districts up for election. In 11 of them, there was only one major party candidate running. So a total of 2 Democrats and 9 Republicans were guaranteed election, barring unforeseen circumstances, and even probably then. I mean, we have elected dead people. But 2 major candidates faced off in the general election in only 14 of the 25 districts that were up for election that year. And that is not an anomaly. As a friend of mine rather aptly put it, almost half of our representatives and senators did not have to conduct one of those pesky campaigns that required a defense of past service or a dialogue over local issues. You know, we hear a lot about voter apathy as if it were a moral deficiency of the, allow me to suggest it may be a highly rational response to non-competitive politics. Watch those same apathetic folks at a local zoning hearing when a liquor store is applying for permission to locate down the street. I would suggest that people save their efforts for places where those efforts count. And thanks to the increasing lack of competitiveness, those places may not include the voting booth. Secondly, gerrymandering has contributed to the polarization of politics and the gridlock it causes. So how? Because when a safe district effectively disenfranchises voters of one party or the other, the only way to oppose an incumbent is in the primary. And that generally means that the challenge is going to come from the flank, from the extreme of the party. In competitive districts, nominees know they have to run to the middle in order to win a general election. When the primary is, in effect, the general election, the battle takes place among the base voters, the party faithful, who also tend to be the most ideological members of both political parties. So Republican incumbents will be challenged from the right, and Democratic incumbents will be challenged from the left. And even when those challenges fail, they leave a powerful incentive for the incumbent to toe the line, to placate the most rigid and ideological elements of each party. Instead of the system working as we hope it was intended, with both parties nominating folks that they think will be most likely to win among a broader constituency in the fall, we get nominees who represent the most extreme voters on each side of the philosophical divide. And then we wonder why the winners can't compromise and get the people's business accomplished. There are significant policy implications of a victory for the Republicans or the Democrats to the extent that the parties represent different philosophies, and these days they unquestionably do. A victory in November means getting the edge for 10 years in imposing one of those philosophies on Indiana government and effectively disenfranchising not only the people who voted for the other party, but the more moderate voters within their own parties. Perhaps the worst consequence of all of this is that reduced participation in the political process and a fairly well-founded belief that large numbers of citizens have been rendered voiceless and politically impotent has significant implications for the very legitimacy of government. Is a representative really representative when he or she is elected by essentially 10 to 20% of the eligible voters in that district? You know, I don't want to conclude without recognizing that there are reasons other than partisan redistricting for the growth of safe seats. In The Big Sort, which is a book I recommend if you haven't read it, Bill Bishop detailed the increasing tendency of Americans to vote with our feet, to live in areas where other people share our values. We can't eliminate that sort of residential self-sorting. It's a phenomenon that has given us bright blue cities in very red states. But we can and we should eliminate the intentional gerrymandering that exacerbates it. If we don't, it really won't matter who wins election, because the winner will encounter the intransigence and gridlock that's such a vivid consequence of the current system, especially at the federal level. That gridlock just adds to the pervasive cynicism about government, a cynicism that further reduces participation. It's really time for citizens of Indiana to rise up and demand changes to the system. The other speakers at this forum are far more expert than I am in both the politics and laws governing redistricting. But I do want to suggest a few obvious elements that a fairer system would include, and these pretty well duplicate what you've heard previously. Areas of common economic interest and existing government boundaries should be respected to the greatest extent possible. Districts should be compact or at least rational in shape. Oddly shaped districts that have clearly been drawn for partisan advantage should be subject to the same standards that courts now apply to districts that have been intentionally drawn to dilute the votes of racial minorities. If political operatives can draw maps that create political advantage, surely they can also draw maps that are consistent with the premises of democracy. Thank you.